I married into a family that knew how to hold a room, and the first time I walked through their front door I felt my breath steady as if the house itself had decided to keep me. The warmth was not loud or performative, but precise and enveloping, the kind that settles into your shoulders and convinces you that whatever life demands next, you will not face it alone. My name is Ariana, and at the beginning there was nothing to forgive, nothing to suspect, nothing to defend myself against, because love arrived fully formed and asked only that I step inside it without hesitation. The house smelled faintly of citrus and old wood, sunlight resting carefully along the edges of polished furniture, framed photographs arranged with an eye for balance rather than sentimentality, and my mother-in-law stood at the center of it all with the ease of someone who had long ago mastered the art of making others feel seen without ever surrendering the spotlight. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that lingered just long enough to signal intimacy, her hand warm at my elbow as she drew me in, introducing me to a space that felt less like a home and more like a cultivated inheritance. I remember thinking, not for the first time, that I had been remarkably fortunate, not simply to marry a man I loved, but to marry into a lineage that felt composed, stable and quietly powerful, the kind of family that spoke in measured tones and resolved disagreements without raised voices or slammed doors. There were rituals rather than rules, traditions rather than demands, and I slipped into them easily, grateful for the relief of not having to fight for my place. My husband watched me with a small, private smile as I navigated those early visits, his pride unmistakable, his confidence in me a gentle pressure at my back, and I felt myself relax in ways I had not realized I'd been holding tense. We were newly married then, still discovering the subtle contours of shared life, the way one person's habits reshape another's sense of time, the way love settles into routines that feel almost ceremonial in their repetition, and I believed, with the earnest certainty of someone who has not yet been corrected by experience, that this steadiness was permanent. There was no sense of being evaluated, no cold pauses in conversation, no sudden shifts in tone when I entered a room, only a seamless integration that made me feel as though I had always belonged there, as though my presence required no justification. My mother-in-law asked about my work with genuine curiosity, remembered details I had mentioned only once, offered advice lightly and withdrew it just as quickly, leaving me with the sense that I was trusted to make my own decisions. Even now, when I revisit those days with the clarity that hindsight insists upon, I cannot locate a single moment that feels false, not because I am unwilling to see it, but because there truly was nothing there to expose. We spoke often, she and I, in the quiet spaces that opened naturally between errands and shared meals, our conversations drifting toward the ordinary vulnerabilities of adult life, the adjustments marriage requires, the subtle negotiations between independence and partnership that no one warns you about with enough specificity. I never felt that I was confessing anything dangerous, only articulating the normal uncertainties that arise when two people learn how to live inside each other's rhythms, and she listened with an attentiveness that felt both maternal and respectful, never interrupting, never correcting, occasionally offering a perspective that seemed rooted in experience rather than judgment. When she spoke about her own marriage, it was with affection tempered by realism, a portrait of partnership that had weathered time without bitterness, and I absorbed those stories as reassurance rather than instruction. If there was a defining feature of those early months, it was ease, the absence of friction so complete that I mistook it for proof of harmony, and in that environment my own guard lowered without resistance. I spoke openly because there was nothing to hide, and because the language of that family encouraged openness, valuing emotional intelligence as a form of maturity, framing reflection as strength rather than weakness. My husband and I hosted dinners, attended birthdays, marked anniversaries with understated celebrations that prioritized presence over spectacle, and I watched how his mother moved through those gatherings, never dominating conversation yet subtly directing its flow, ensuring no one felt overlooked, smoothing over potential awkwardness with a deft change of subject or a timely compliment. I admired her, not with the awe reserved for authority, but with the appreciation one feels for competence exercised gracefully. There were moments, of course, when the private reality of marriage pressed against the idealized version we presented to the world, when fatigue sharpened words or expectations misaligned, but these moments felt contained, manageable, the kind of challenges that strengthen rather than threaten. When I mentioned them in passing, framed as curiosities rather than complaints, the response I received was always proportionate, never alarmist, reinforcing my belief that I was navigating this transition with reasonable self-awareness. I did not feel watched. I did not feel recorded. I felt accompanied. The family operated on a principle of discretion, valuing privacy without secrecy, and I appreciated the distinction, believing it to be evidence of emotional maturity rather than control. Nothing about my interactions suggested that they would echo beyond their immediate context, and I trusted that the intimacy of conversation would remain where it belonged, shared between adults capable of holding nuance without distortion. If anything, I felt supported in ways that allowed me to deepen my commitment to my husband, encouraged to voice concerns rather than suppress them, reassured that adjustment was a process rather than a test to be passed. There was no pressure to perform happiness, only an expectation of honesty delivered with care, and I met that expectation gladly. The truth, uncomfortable as it may be to acknowledge now, is that I was happy, not in a dramatic or intoxicating way, but in the steady, grounded manner that allows one to imagine a future without anxiety. I made plans without calculating escape routes. I invested emotionally without reserving portions of myself for self-protection. I believed that the foundation beneath us was solid, reinforced by shared values and mutual respect. Looking back, I understand that the most significant thing about that period was not what happened, but what did not, the absence of warning signs that might have prompted caution, the lack of conflict that could have sharpened my perception. There was no storm on the horizon, no sudden chill in the air, no intuitive resistance that I ignored out of optimism, only a continuity of kindness that lulled me into the confidence that nothing essential could be misinterpreted. I did not imagine that the same calm that made that family so appealing could also make it impermeable, that the smoothness of those interactions might one day make it difficult to identify where one feeling ended and another began. At the time, I was simply grateful to have found a place where love did not feel volatile, where belonging did not require performance, and where my voice seemed to land gently, received without distortion. If this were a different kind of story, I might tell you that something felt off even then, that a shadow crossed my mind which I dismissed too quickly, but that would be dishonest, and honesty matters here more than drama. In the beginning, there was only normalcy rendered beautifully, affection offered without conditions, and a family that welcomed me with open hands and steady eyes, asking nothing more than that I trust what was given. And I did. The first changes were so small they registered only as texture, not direction, like a shift in air pressure you feel in your ears before you understand that weather is moving in. Nothing broke, nothing cracked, nothing announced itself as a problem, and if someone had asked me then whether my marriage was failing, I would have answered without hesitation that we were simply tired, simply busy, simply learning how to carry more responsibility without dropping tenderness along the way. My husband began coming home later, not dramatically so, just late enough to alter the rhythm of our evenings, and when I asked about his day he answered with care rather than ease, as though he were choosing words instead of letting them find him. Conversations shortened, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence seemed to arrive sooner than it used to, settling between us with a weight that felt temporary, fixable, undeserving of alarm. I told myself that this was marriage maturing, shedding its early intensity for something quieter and more durable, and when unease surfaced it felt disloyal to give it too much attention, as though naming it might give it power it did not yet deserve. I adjusted instead, speaking more gently, listening more carefully, offering space where I sensed it was needed, believing that love expressed through restraint was still love. Around us, life continued without interruption, family gatherings unfolding with their usual precision, holidays marked by familiar rituals that reassured rather than surprised, and in those settings my husband seemed unchanged, affectionate in public, attentive in ways that reassured others even as they left me oddly untouched. I noticed the contrast without assigning meaning to it, assuming that private relationships naturally carry different weights than public ones. If there was a pattern, it emerged through repetition rather than intensity, through the accumulation of moments that felt slightly misaligned, responses that seemed to answer questions I had not asked, defensiveness where I had intended curiosity. When disagreements arose, they resolved quickly on the surface, apologies exchanged, compromises articulated, yet something lingered afterward, an unresolved residue that did not match the simplicity of the conflict. I began to feel as though I were stepping into conversations already in progress, as though conclusions had been reached in rooms where I had not been present, and this sensation unsettled me not because it suggested betrayal, but because it resisted logic. There were no secrets, no hidden messages, no unexplained absences, only a growing sense that my perspective no longer aligned with the emotional reality my husband seemed to be inhabiting. When I tried to address this directly, framing my concern as confusion rather than accusation, the response was careful, almost rehearsed, assurances delivered with a patience that felt disproportionate to the situation, as though he were calming someone rather than engaging with an equal. He spoke about patterns, about how certain conversations always left him unsettled, about feeling as though he were constantly managing emotional fallout, and I listened, searching my memory for evidence of the dynamic he described. I could not find it, not because I refused to see my own flaws, but because the picture he painted did not match my experience of us, and this discrepancy began to erode my confidence in my own perceptions. I wondered if I had been careless with my words without realizing it, if I had normalized tensions that he experienced as strain, if my understanding of partnership was simply incompatible with his. During this time, my mother-in-law remained a steady presence, unchanged in tone or demeanor, her interactions with me as warm and composed as ever, and I took comfort in that consistency, believing it to be evidence that whatever turbulence existed between my husband and me had not altered the broader foundation of family. She never intervened, never asked probing questions, never offered unsolicited opinions, yet when we spoke, as we still did, she listened with the same attentive calm that had initially made me feel safe. I did not speak to her with urgency or distress, only with the candor of someone working through ordinary marital recalibration, and she responded as she always had, acknowledging complexity without inflating it, validating effort rather than assigning fault. If she encouraged patience, it felt appropriate. If she suggested perspective, it felt grounded, and I left those conversations reassured that time and goodwill would do what they usually do. What I did not see was the subtle shift in how others began to engage with me, the slight hesitations that crept into interactions with extended family, the way questions about my work or plans became less curious and more perfunctory, as though interest had been replaced by obligation. These changes were too diffuse to confront, too gentle to protest, and I attributed them to my own heightened sensitivity during a period of adjustment. Social gatherings became more carefully navigated, not because anyone was unkind, but because warmth no longer flowed effortlessly in my direction, and I compensated by offering more, by leaning into conversation, by ensuring that I did not appear withdrawn or defensive. I did not realize that in doing so I was responding to an atmosphere I did not yet understand, trying to correct a perception I had never been made aware of. At home, the distance between my husband and me grew not through conflict but through restraint, through the careful avoidance of topics that seemed to lead nowhere productive, through a mutual desire to preserve peace that slowly hollowed intimacy. We functioned well, managed logistics efficiently, fulfilled obligations with competence, yet the emotional reciprocity that once felt instinctive now required negotiation. When he finally suggested space, not as a threat but as a consideration, the word landed with a dull finality that surprised me, not because it was devastating but because it felt premature, as though a conclusion had been reached before the conversation had fully unfolded. He spoke about clarity, about needing to think without pressure, about wanting what was best for both of us, and I listened, struggling to reconcile his calm certainty with my own sense that something essential remained unresolved. The separation that followed was quiet, almost administrative, belongings divided without drama, schedules adjusted with efficiency, friends informed with carefully worded explanations that emphasized mutual respect. There was no single moment of rupture, no argument that could be revisited for meaning, only a gradual disengagement that left me questioning not just what had happened, but how it had happened without my noticing the point of no return. In the aftermath, grief arrived slowly, not as a wave but as a persistent undercurrent, and with it came doubt not about my feelings but about my role in their dissolution. I replayed conversations, searched for missteps, interrogated my own intentions, and found myself increasingly uncertain of the reliability of my memory, unsettled by the possibility that I had misunderstood my own life. What I could not yet articulate, though it pressed against the edges of my awareness, was the strangeness of how complete the narrative of our failure already seemed to be for everyone else, as though the story had been told and settled before I had realized it was being written. I felt excluded from my own history, positioned as a character whose motivations were assumed rather than explored, and this realization, still indistinct, marked the beginning of a reckoning I was not yet ready to name. At that stage I still believed in repair, in explanation, in the power of clarity to realign what had drifted, And it did not occur to me that clarity itself might have been shaped elsewhere, that understanding might have been guided long before I sought it. I was focused on survival, on regaining equilibrium, on making sense of a loss that felt both intimate and impersonal, unaware that the most important questions had not yet presented themselves. I did not know then that the marriage was already over in more ways than one, not because love had vanished, but because meaning had been reassigned, and once that happens, no amount of sincerity can restore what has been quietly redefined. Distance has a way of reorganizing memory, not by erasing it, but by stripping away urgency until patterns emerge with an unsettling clarity. And it was only after my life settled into a quieter, more solitary rhythm that I began to notice how neatly certain moments aligned, how conversations I had dismissed as ordinary now seemed to share a common shape. I was no longer defending a marriage, no longer negotiating peace, no longer measuring every thought for its potential impact. And in that stillness my recollections began to rearrange themselves into something that demanded attention. At first, the realization announced itself gently, almost politely, as a question rather than an accusation, prompted by nothing more dramatic than a familiar phrase repeated in a new context, a concern expressed by someone who should not have had access to it. I heard my own words echoed back to me, not verbatim but translated, stripped of nuance and delivered with a weight I had never intended, and the recognition unsettled me because it did not feel like miscommunication, but like reinterpretation. I began tracing these moments backward, not with suspicion but with curiosity, following the thread of who had known what and when, and what emerged was not a web of lies, but a series of perfectly reasonable conversations that, taken individually, explained nothing and accused no one. There was no single statement I could point to and say this was wrong, no distortion so blatant it could be challenged, only a gradual accumulation of emphasis, a subtle tilting of perspective that transformed context into conclusion. The unsettling part was not that my words had traveled, but that they had arrived with a coherence I had not given them, assembled into a narrative that suggested instability rather than reflection, dissatisfaction rather than adjustment, a pattern rather than a process. I recognized that narrative because I had lived inside it without realizing it was being shaped, my uncertainties reframed as indicators, my openness curated into evidence of something larger. What broke through my reluctance to name this was the consistency with which certain themes appeared, always expressed with concern rather than judgment, always positioned as care rather than critique, and always originating from the same source, even when relayed by others who believed they were sharing independent observations. The precision of it was what finally pierced my denial, the way the emotional tone remained intact even as the words themselves changed hands. I thought back to those early conversations, the ones that had felt so safe, so grounded in mutual respect, and I realized that what I had mistaken for empathy was something far more disciplined, an attentiveness that catalogued rather than connected, an understanding that did not seek to intervene but to contextualize. My mother-in-law had never told me what to do, never warned me explicitly, never offered criticism disguised as advice, and it was precisely this restraint that allowed her interpretations to pass unchallenged. She had not misrepresented me, at least not in any way that could be disproven, but she had interpreted me consistently, translating my experience into a language that prioritized emotional stability above all else. And in doing so she had framed my normal uncertainties as risks to be managed rather than conversations to be had. By the time these interpretations reached my husband, they arrived not as accusations but as accumulated concern, reinforced by repetition and timing. What struck me with a force that bordered on nausea was the realization that my husband had not been persuaded through argument, but through atmosphere, surrounded by a steady current of worry that felt organic because it was never presented as intervention. He had come to his conclusions honestly, believing them to be his own, unaware of how thoroughly the emotional environment around him had been curated. I revisited our final conversations with this new lens, recognizing phrases he had used that mirrored ones I had heard elsewhere, noticing how his certainty had been built from language that was not quite his, not quite mine, but something in between, shaped to feel reasonable. The defensiveness I had sensed was not a reaction to me, but to an internal conflict between loyalty and protection, a conflict he resolved by choosing the narrative that promised peace. There was no malice in what my mother-in-law had done, at least not in a way that aligned with the stories we tell ourselves about cruelty, and that was what made it so devastating, the way intent hid behind benevolence, the way care became a vehicle for control without ever declaring itself as such. She had not needed to lie because truth, when arranged carefully, can suggest almost anything. As this understanding settled, grief shifted into something sharper, not anger exactly, but a focused clarity that demanded response. And with it came a reckoning with my own complicity, not in the outcome but in the access I had granted without discernment. I had assumed shared values guaranteed shared ethics, that emotional intelligence precluded manipulation, and this assumption had left me unguarded in a space where interpretation held more power than fact. What mattered now was not confrontation, which would only collapse the architecture into defensiveness, but comprehension, the full scope of what had been constructed and how it functioned. I needed to understand not just what had happened, but why it had worked so effectively, why no one, including myself, had questioned the coherence of a story that resolved so neatly without conflict. The answer lay in the family's devotion to harmony, their preference for emotional order over emotional truth, and in that context, my expressed uncertainty had been experienced as disruption, not because it was excessive, but because it resisted simplification. My mother-in-law had acted as a translator, smoothing complexity into caution, offering her son a version of reality that felt manageable. Recognizing this did not bring immediate relief, but it did restore something essential that had been eroding quietly since the separation, my trust in my own perception. I was not imagining the misalignment, nor had I failed to communicate. I had simply spoken into a system that filtered meaning according to its own priorities, an understanding that shifted the weight of blame away from my character and back onto the dynamics that had shaped interpretation. This was not a revelation I shared with anyone at first, not because I feared disbelief, but because I needed time to sit with its implications, to decide what it demanded of me. Awareness alone did not constitute resolution, and clarity without action risked becoming another form of self-betrayal. By the time I accepted that this understanding marked a point of no return, that I could not unknow what I now saw, my grief had settled into resolve, quiet but unyielding, and with that resolve came the recognition that repair was no longer the goal. The marriage as it had existed could not be reclaimed because its meaning had been fundamentally altered, and any attempt to restore it would require me to inhabit a narrative that was not my own. What remained was the question of balance, of whether the story that had been constructed in my absence would continue to define me, or whether I would intervene in a way that honored truth without replicating the harm done to me. The answer was not yet fully formed, but the direction was clear, and it pointed away from silence, toward a reckoning that would not announce itself with drama, but would unfold with the same quiet inevitability that had brought me here. Once I understood that the damage had been done through atmosphere rather than accusation, I stopped looking for moments of confrontation and began paying attention to spaces, because influence does not announce itself through arguments but through proximity, through the steady repetition of presence that makes certain interpretations feel natural. I did not need to expose anything to begin undoing it. I needed only to re-enter the environment from which I had quietly been removed and exist there without apology or explanation. I returned gradually, not as someone seeking redemption, but as someone who had never forfeited her place, accepting invitations I had once declined out of self-protection, attending gatherings without rehearsing defensiveness, allowing my demeanor to remain steady even when conversations brushed against subjects that once would have tightened my chest. I did not attempt to correct assumptions, nor did I volunteer clarifications, because I understood now that narratives collapse most effectively when deprived of reinforcement rather than challenged head-on. What surprised me was how little effort this required once I stopped trying to be understood, how quickly normalcy reasserted itself when I simply allowed people to experience me directly rather than through mediated concern. Over time, interactions lengthened, curiosity resurfaced, and the careful distance I had sensed before began to dissolve, not because anyone apologized, but because the emotional logic that had justified it no longer held. My mother-in-law remained courteous, composed, and gracious, her manner unchanged in ways that might have gone unnoticed had I not been attuned to the subtle recalibrations beneath the surface. She spoke less about emotional well-being and more about logistics, less about feelings and more about schedules, and this shift was not defensive but adaptive, as though she sensed that the context which had once made her interpretations welcome was no longer fully intact. I did nothing to provoke this change, nor did I attempt to exploit it, trusting instead that consistency would accomplish what confrontation never could. I shared parts of my life openly, not confessions, not justifications, simply facts delivered without embellishment, allowing others to integrate this information organically, to reconcile it with the image they had been given without being instructed to do so. As these reconciliations occurred, I noticed how my mother-in-law began to repeat herself, not in content but in tone, offering the same measured concern in situations that did not quite warrant it, and this repetition, once reassuring, now stood out against the ease of other interactions. Where her voice had once guided emotional interpretation, it now sounded slightly out of sync, as though it were answering a question no one had asked. The effect was not dramatic but cumulative, and it manifested in small hesitations, in the way conversations subtly bypassed her framing, in how people responded to her concern with acknowledgement rather than alignment. She was not being challenged, but neither was she being deferred to, and the distinction mattered more than overt resistance ever could. I became increasingly aware of how invested she had been in maintaining a certain equilibrium, not out of malice, but out of a belief that emotional order required management, and as that management lost its efficacy, something brittle emerged beneath her composure. She remained polite, even kind, but the effortless authority she once carried began to feel conditional, dependent on a consensus that was quietly dissolving. There was no moment when the truth was declared, no scene of exposure that restructured the family overnight, only a gradual reorientation of perception that left my mother-in-law in an unfamiliar position, no longer the primary interpreter of emotional reality. The very restraint that had made her influence so effective now worked against her, because without reinforcement, interpretation became indistinguishable from projection. When she finally addressed the distance between us, she did so indirectly, framing it as concern for the family's cohesion rather than for her own role within it, and I listened without interruption, recognizing the language of care that had once seemed so reassuring. When she finished, I responded not with accusation, but with clarity, acknowledging her intention to protect while naming calmly and precisely the consequences of interpretation offered without consent. I did not accuse her of sabotage, nor did I suggest malice, because neither claim would have advanced understanding, and instead I spoke about impact, about how stories gain weight through repetition, about how care can become controlling when it replaces curiosity. I did not ask her to agree with me, only to hear me, and in that moment something shifted, not because she conceded, but because she recognized that her authority over the narrative had been interrupted. The conversation ended without resolution, but it did not need one, because its purpose was not to secure acknowledgement, but to establish presence, to make it clear that silence would no longer do the work of maintaining equilibrium. I left that exchange with a sense of alignment I had not felt in years, not triumphant, but grounded, certain that whatever came next would not unfold without my participation. In the weeks that followed, the family dynamic continued to adjust, not collapsing but recalibrating, and in that process my mother-in-law found herself increasingly sidelined in discussions that once would have passed through her by default. Decisions were made collaboratively, emotions expressed directly, and the atmosphere of mediated concern gave way to something messier but more honest. This was the revenge, though it did not resemble punishment, and it did not require the destruction of relationships, only the dismantling of a structure that had allowed one person's interpretations to override lived experience. My mother-in-law was not ostracized, not humiliated, not exposed, but she was changed by the loss of influence she had never acknowledged wielding. As for my husband, our interactions remained minimal and civil, shaped by the reality that understanding does not always restore intimacy, and I accepted that without bitterness. He had acted in good faith within a narrative he believed to be true, and while that truth had been curated, responsibility for the future lay elsewhere now. What mattered most was that I no longer moved through these spaces as a problem to be managed, but as a person with agency. My presence no longer filtered through concern, my words no longer translated before they were heard. The system that had once rendered me uncertain of myself had lost its coherence, and in its place, something less orderly but far more authentic had begun to take shape. I did not need acknowledgement to feel vindicated, nor did I need apologies to feel complete, because the restoration of my own voice had accomplished what exposure never could. The story that had been told about me no longer held, not because it had been disproven, but because it no longer fit, and that quiet displacement was both irreversible and sufficient. Closure did not arrive as a revelation or a confrontation, but as a steady narrowing of possibilities, the quiet recognition that nothing more needed to be said for the truth to settle where it belonged. By the time the family gathered again for a milestone celebration months later, the atmosphere had already changed in ways that required no announcement, and I stepped into that space with a calm that surprised even me, aware that whatever remained unresolved would no longer have the power to define me. My mother-in-law greeted me as she always had, her smile precise, her tone impeccably warm, but there was a difference now that could not be smoothed over by courtesy, a slight delay in her gaze, a carefulness in her words that suggested she was no longer certain how they would land. She was still respected, still included, still central in appearance, yet the current that once carried her interpretations effortlessly through the room had weakened, and without that current her influence felt contained rather than expansive. What struck me most was not her discomfort, but my own lack of urgency, the absence of that old need to be understood or absolved, because I had already reclaimed the one thing that mattered, my confidence in the coherence of my own experience. I moved through conversations without guarding my tone, without anticipating misinterpretation, and people responded to that ease instinctively, meeting me where I stood rather than where they had been led to expect me to be. My former husband was there too, quieter than I remembered, attentive in a way that suggested reflection rather than certainty, and when our eyes met there was no bitterness in the exchange, only an acknowledgement of shared history reframed by distance. We spoke briefly not about the past but about ordinary things, work, plans, mutual acquaintances, and in that simplicity I recognized that whatever narrative had once divided us no longer held enough authority to dictate the present. The true ending, the one that brought resolution without spectacle, came later that evening in a moment so unremarkable it would have been easy to overlook if I had not been attuned to its significance. A family discussion arose around a minor disagreement, differing recollections of an event, nothing consequential, and for the first time I watched as multiple perspectives were allowed to coexist without being smoothed into consensus, without being translated into concern. My mother-in-law offered her interpretation, measured and composed as ever, but this time it landed alongside others rather than above them, considered but not adopted wholesale, and the conversation moved forward without deferring to her framing. No one contradicted her outright, no one challenged her authority, yet the shift was unmistakable, and in that shift lay the quiet conclusion of a story she had once shaped with such care. She noticed it too. I saw it in the brief tightening of her expression, the recalibration that followed as she adjusted to a reality where her perspective was no longer the organizing principle, and in that moment, I understood that nothing further was required of me. The balance had been restored not through exposure or accusation, but through presence sustained long enough to recalibrate perception. Later, as the evening wound down and conversations thinned, she approached me with a composure that held just enough vulnerability to signal that she understood something had changed irreversibly. She spoke about family, about intentions, about how easily care can become overwhelming when everyone wants what is best, and I listened without interruption not because I was waiting to respond, but because listening no longer felt like surrender. When I did speak, my words were simple, not an argument, not a defense, but a statement of boundary delivered without heat, acknowledging the past without reopening it, affirming my place without demanding recognition. I told her that I trusted myself now, that I was no longer willing to have my inner life interpreted on my behalf, and that this was not a request, but a reality she could either respect or resist at her own cost. She did not argue. She did not apologize. She nodded once, a gesture that contained more concession than any words could have offered, and we parted with a politeness that felt newly honest, stripped of its earlier undertones. In that exchange, the final thread of ambiguity dissolved, leaving behind a clarity that did not need reinforcement. The aftermath was quiet, life resuming its ordinary cadence without dramatic fallout, relationships continuing with adjusted expectations, and I found that the questions which had once consumed me no longer demanded answers. I did not need my story validated by consensus, nor did I need acknowledgement of wrongdoing to feel complete, because the outcome spoke for itself in the way I moved through the world unburdened by doubt. The revenge, if it can be called that, was not the diminishment of another, but the restoration of myself, the refusal to carry a narrative that had been shaped without my consent, and the insistence on occupying space without translation. My mother-in-law lived on with her reputation intact but altered, no longer the quiet architect of emotional reality, and that loss of control was consequence enough. As for me, I did not emerge hardened or distrustful, but clarified, aware now of how easily care can become control and how essential it is to guard one's voice even in spaces that feel safe. I rebuilt my life without spectacle, choosing relationships grounded in directness rather than interpretation. And in doing so I found a peace that did not require constant maintenance. The story ends not with triumph but with alignment, the kind that settles deeply and stays, because it is rooted not in winning, but in knowing exactly where you stand and refusing to move from that place again.